This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
The White House and Washington through the eyes of an international journalist, Philip Crowther, on this edition of Conversations. Philip Crowther is a seasoned journalist who has covered major news stories around the globe. Based in the nation's capital, he serves as the international affiliate reporter for the Associated Press, reporting in 5 different languages. He is also the White House correspondent for the French television network France 24. Additionally, he contributes to a variety of other news organizations, including CNN and the BBC. We welcome Philip Crowther to Conversations. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you.
As we tape this program, a huge news story has just hit. The Mueller report was released. What was the initial response from the White House press corps?
Well, the initial response for all of us, I think, should have been to not do anything and just read it for, I think, what would have lasted about 7 or 8 hours. Now, the truth is, and I have to admit, I didn't have the time to read this thing because we had to report pretty much directly on it. And so we read snippets of it, had to rely on others, our colleagues, to go through it quicker, those who maybe had a little bit more manpower. So the first thing for us was to get things straight on our line and see what the conclusions truly were and be confident that we could report on it accurately and not jump to conclusions. Luckily, there were conclusions in there, of course, from the special counsel himself. Now, at the White House, they were ready for this, of course, and they had seen a copy prior. Most members of the inner circle of the president had seen this report beforehand and were able to prepare for it. So their initial reaction and the president's initial reaction on Twitter was that this was a victory for him again. I say again because, of course, the 4-page summary from the Attorney General had been released the previous month. They believed that this was, again, an exoneration, that there was proof that there had been no collusion, that there had been no obstruction of justice. The president believes that there had been presidential harassment. Now, the day was strange, though, because as we read more into this report, I think most of us journalists and members of the White House press corps saw that it was a pretty damning report and a pretty damning portrait of the president, of how the White House functions, how the campaign machine functioned at the time. And at the same time, you saw the president being very happy with it. You saw one of his closest counselors, Kellyanne Conway, came out to speak to us in the driveway. And she told us, for example, she believed that the re-election of Donald Trump was now a guarantee because of this, and that day had been the best day for the president since he was elected. So it's very strange for us to see a very positive White House on, by the way, a very sunny, a very positive day as well. It was a very pleasant day in Washington, D.C., while we were reading something that we thought was pretty negative for the president. He spoke to us very, very shortly. There was just a few short words from him. And interestingly enough, there were, I think, maybe up to 100 journalists at the Marine One departure because he was on his way to Florida for the weekend, in fact. And we were firmly expecting him to stop by us and to celebrate what he would consider a victory. But he didn't. He walked by with the First Lady and we got nothing. So we're still, at that time, we were still trying to find out what did the president really make of this report. I think we generally, and I think the headlines the day after, were clearly that this was a damaging report for the president.
I was going to say, as we tape this program, so we're a day after the release, and who knows what will develop by the time this goes to air, but it does seem like the president's tone has changed a little bit this morning compared to what it was yesterday.
Yeah, it's strange. You never really know what kind of a mood he is in. The tweets sometimes are indicative of this. Not always. He can be in a good mood and still have an aggressive tweet here or there. But again, he went after the report in very strong terms, one of which, you don't tend to put on television. Right. As there was a line also in the Mueller report itself, there was a word we cannot use. He didn't seem to like the reporting on it. And, this is a president who reacts that way. He watches TV a lot. He will look at the coverage. He will see the headlines. Some of his aides will give him articles, the editorials maybe of that day, that might be positive or might be negative towards him. And then he'll really make up his mind, and then he will have some angry tweets once in a while. So the impression about 24 hours after the release of the report was that the White House was trying to spin this in a positive way, but the president certainly wasn't happy with the coverage he was getting. So that's more or less where we stood after about 24 hours.
How damaging politically do you believe this report is for Donald Trump?
I don't think it is at all. And that has been the case with almost every story that has been negative about this president, even during the campaign and during the first 2 years of his time in the White House. He could do a lot of things, and his supporters were not going to lose faith. And that, I think, is going to be the case this time around again. There's really something that helped him here. And that is that drip, as we call it, of news stories that had to do with the investigation, because there were so many leaks and there was so much good reporting. Right. As we now know, the reporting was excellent, and it was proved right by the report itself. This drip meant that the actual release of the report was not such a shock and not such a scandal. If you imagine the report coming out, let's say, ignore the 2 years of the presidency, difficult to do, but just imagine you're 2 years into somebody's presidency and this kind of a report comes out. You would basically say, how can the president get out of this? How can a president survive a document that is so damning, that is so damaging? But because we've been getting prepared for this slowly but surely, and the White House knew more or less what was coming, and we're fearing something that in fact was worse than the end result, that is why I think Donald Trump's supporters aren't really reacting to this in a negative way, especially if they are watching the news sources that are positive toward the president. And of course, that's a really big element of this. If you are watching a news channel that tends to support the president or speak positively of him, that's exactly the kind of thing you'll be hearing after the publication of the report as well.
Right. How did the Democrats play it? It seems to me like they're going to have to walk a fine line here.
Yeah, it's a difficult one for them. It's, in a sense, it's good news and bad news. The bad news is they'll have to make a decision now, Democrats in Congress, that is, especially in the House of Representatives. They'll have to decide, what do we do with this? Do we investigate further? What they certainly got from this was an impetus to investigate further, an impetus that they got actually from the special counsel, because there is that moment in the report where he essentially says, and I'm paraphrasing here, he couldn't really make up his mind and didn't really have enough proof to say there truly was obstruction of justice from the president. But there is a moment where he says, but let's let Congress take a look at this. The Attorney General did, in the end, make his very own conclusions. Congress still has not, and they can decide to investigate further. Now, the problem, of course, at the end of such an investigation, what do you have at the end of such an investigation? Possibly impeachment proceedings, which a lot of members of the Democratic Party simply don't want to happen, especially because we're so close, relatively close, I should say, to the next presidential election. So Democrats saw in this document a lot that they could play with, so to say, a lot for them to work on. A lot of negative details of how the president conducted himself in the White House, a lot of intent to obstruct justice, etc., etc. A lot really for them to work with. And already we know that they're going to subpoena the whole report with the redacted portions no longer redacted. That might give us further revelations. In other words, what we thought might be a moment of closure with the publication of the Mueller report was not a moment of closure in the slightest. It was one chapter that ended. The White House will still be defending itself. The president will still be defending himself. And they will still have to, because the story will continue up on Capitol Hill and probably all the way into the next presidential election. Some of these investigations, by the way, you can't be sure that they will wrap up before the presidential election. So these are things that we could very well be talking about all the way to 2020.
Since you are obviously a member of the White House press corps, I have to ask you about this, because one of the things that came out in the report actually called into question Sarah Sanders' credibility. What was the response of the White House press corps on that issue?
Well, if there hadn't been another story that day, and there was a rather big one, we had to kind of cherry pick, in a sense, what we were going to concentrate on. If this had been the only revelation of the day, then the story of the day would have been, will Sarah Sanders resign from her post? Because the proof was that she had lied to us, which is essentially something that a press secretary cannot be found doing. You cannot lie to the press corps. A press secretary can be, as someone would put it, economical with the truth. They can, they can spin it this way and that, but they can't outright lie to us. That's a reason for a press secretary to resign. So that would have driven the news cycle right after that revelation. Now, the problem is, of course, we don't see much of her. She doesn't have regular briefings anymore. If she had, then we would have, someone in the press corps would have asked, are you going to resign? Chances are that she wouldn't, because this is, after all, a White House that gets away with quite a lot of lies. The president has given her his full support, and I think will continue to do so. Now, I wouldn't say that we necessarily had that much faith in her, because we know that some things she says at the podium are demonstrably false. So it's difficult for us to believe everything she says. We have to try, of course. She's a press secretary. She's supposed to answer our questions. She has all the right to put a White House spin on things. We then have to, of course, find out where the spin is and what is entirely correct and what might be a little bit not so correct. I don't know how our relationship with her will continue. I haven't seen her since she wasn't there that day. So we weren't able actually to ask her directly whether what was revealed in the Mueller report was a reason for her to resign. But I think those are calls that will continue, simply because black on white, we now know that at one, not just during one press briefing, but during several, she outright lied to us. Right.
But under oath, she told the truth.
That's exactly what happened.
That's the conflict for those who are following.
And I think that's why we have to trust the Mueller report so much. Right. These are quotes that came under oath from pretty much everybody. Right. Makes it very difficult for the president also to question those quotes. So we, I think, as journalists, treat it as a pretty definitive document, because all of these quotes were made under oath. So finally, in a sense, we have this document where, in many instances, those who were asked to give their version of events will no longer be able to change them. So we really have 448 pages that tell the story of the potential of collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign, and tells the potential of obstruction of justice by the president. And I think really that's what it boils down to. There was no proof of collusion in this, but there were clearly attempts by Russian operatives to collude with the Trump campaign. There was interest on behalf of the Trump campaign, but it never came to an actual conspiracy. When it comes to obstruction of justice, there are clearly many attempts by the president to obstruct justice. And in many of those cases, it was his close circle of friends who basically stopped him from doing so and didn't carry out the orders that he had given them. So in both cases, especially in the obstruction of justice case, the president came incredibly close to obstructing justice. So those are really the big conclusions that the special counsel makes, and that we all should make, I suppose.
How do we deal with going forward, the idea that the Russians were trying to come in and influence our election process?
Well, the way forward is for it not to happen again, of course. The impression, of course, that this White House gave at the very start, let's say the first half year or so, was that they were not concentrating on this, that they were not working on making things better, on improving systems, on improving cyber defenses against Russian cyber attacks. Since then, the administration, I think, has done some serious work on that. Now, we know, for example, from the midterm elections, that this type of large-scale attack, so to say, this type of intent to sway things in an election was not as successful as it was in 2016. We know that there are attempts underway right now for 2020. We know since 2016 that there have been many Russian attempts to influence elections in the likes of Montenegro and France, all over Europe, anywhere where they can sow a little bit of discord. I think at this point we can't guarantee that it won't happen again, but I think those who were targeted by these attacks were basically the American voters. And, of course, campaigns themselves. I think there are two aspects to this. The Democratic campaign was hacked. The Hillary Clinton campaign, or rather one of her very close advisors, his personal email was hacked. That was John Podesta, of course. In that sense, campaigns will have to be more careful. They'll have to have better cyber defenses. But then, of course, a lot of what happened was misinformation that came toward the U.S. voter. the American people were affected by this and were served up fake news that was produced by the likes of Russian bots or Russian operatives in St. Petersburg. And I think we basically just all have to be smarter about how we consume news online. We have to be smarter about what we are absolutely certain is true and what might not be. We have to look at the sources, where things come from, and become more literate when it comes to news consumption. So there's a lot to do there.
Speaking of that, what are your thoughts? As a journalist who covers the White House and covers Washington and international affairs, how should the general public approach their news gathering? In other words, the way they consume news. What advice would you have for them?
That's a tough one. I would say, first of all, read newspapers that are trusted. Read them online, of course, or the paper version. Don't consume just one 24-hour news channel. Cable news is pretty dangerous right now because there's such a political divide in there. I mean, everybody knows that Fox News is slanted to the right, that MSNBC is slanted to the left, and that CNN might usually be slanted to the center left, but might be moving a little bit to the left as well. I don't think you should be getting all your news from one of those sources. You should be very aware of what the good sources are, and if possible, have a diet, if you will, of different news sources. Ask around what the most trusted news sources are. In my case, I would say try and get your news maybe from news agencies. I know that's a little bit difficult to do, but a lot of their pieces are published in local newspapers, the Associated Press, Reuters, AFP. That's factual reporting by definition. Then there are newspapers that have really proven how good they are during these first few years of the Trump presidency. And we know this from the Mueller report. Again, the reporting by the Washington Post and the New York Times was excellent. It was based on facts, it was incredibly well-sourced, and it was accurate. Go towards those publications that over the last 2 years have really done a great job, despite attacks from the president, false attacks that they produced fake news, which they clearly did not. They produced things that hurt the president, but that were factual. I would also say have a look at maybe some foreign sources, because there will be that extra step back from what is happening here in the United States. As foreign correspondents, we take a step back and we analyze things maybe with a little bit of distance. We look at things maybe from our own national perspectives, or we try and explain things with a little bit more historic context, if you will. For example, if a foreign correspondent writes an article about the Trump administration, he or she will have to explain a lot of the basics to the reader, and maybe we need that here as well. So multiply your news sources would be one of my main pieces of advice. And really, when you're online, make sure you know who published that piece that seems to be so attractive, that seems to be clickbait or has an incredibly loud headline. Make sure you know where it's coming from. I don't have a clear piece of advice, but those would be some of the things that I would mention.
Do you believe that the media in this country has a bias one way or the other? And I'm not talking about the opinion journalists. I'm not talking about Fox or MSNBC. I'm talking about the quote-unquote mainstream media.
I'd put it this way. The mainstream media, not really a term that I like all too much, but that's media that is consumed by a lot of people. Right. Let's put it that way. I think, and maybe I can say we in the mainstream media, try to cover this president like we would cover any other president. That's really what I want to believe is happening and what I think is happening. This president is extraordinary in what he does, in what he gets away with, the things he says, the way he acts. And I think we should cover him as if he was any other president. We shouldn't normalize things that if one of his predecessors had said would have been a massive news story. We can't just forget those things and just say, it's President Trump. I think we need to keep reporting just the sheer extraordinary nature of this presidency. I don't think it's a secret that a lot of newsrooms have a lot of left-leaning journalists in them. I think journalism as a trade has I think, historically attracted maybe people who lean a little bit to the left. But if they do, they should, and that's something that I was taught and most journalists are taught, you leave those opinions at the door and then you just report the facts. Now, what I'd say about the media landscape here in the United States, though, is it's not doing very well if you're watching 24-hour cable news channels. That is a very tough business that we're looking at right now. There is a lot of shouting, and there are a lot of talking heads, and there is just not enough factual reporting. If you look at international 24-hour news channels, there are more images, there's more reporting, actual reporting on the ground, there is more factual reporting, there are fewer talking heads. You're not going to have a person from the right shouting at someone from the left and that shouting match continuing for a whole 30 minutes or so. That's just something that is not going to move the story forward. So I think the moment where the news presenter here in the United States, this has happened in Europe as well, where the news presenter became someone who was allowed to comment on the news, that was the moment where things went wrong. Where you have you can name anyone from all of the 24-hour news channels, where you have a Tucker Carlson, for example, or a Sean Hannity on the right, or you might have a Chris Cuomo or a Don Lemon on the, let's say, center-left, who knows, where they address the camera. Or Rachel, of course, we should mention, of course, Rachel Maddow on the left, for example, where they address the camera, they look like they are an anchor of a news show. You want to trust them as an anchor of a news show because they have that authority. They are in that seat. They are telling you the news. But then all of a sudden, things switch and they are giving you their opinion, also straight to camera. They are addressing you. They are telling you what they think, and they're telling you what you should be thinking. That should never happen, in my opinion. A news anchor has to remain a news anchor and just give you the news factually. They have the freedom of bringing on guests, of course, who have opinions and who can then be fact-checked. But the moment where I think the presenter of a news, the anchor, let's say, of a news program turned into somebody who was allowed to comment on the news, that's where things went wrong here in this country. It's also something that we're seeing in other countries, but here that polarization really is quite extreme right now.
Given the way this President Trump, approaches the media, he's very much kind of in their face, so to speak, and it obviously is the first president to really use Twitter in this sort of aggressive manner. Is this a one-off, or do you see presidents in the future that this is the new standard?
Well, there's no way back, in a sense, from President Trump. I think it's, be it a 4-year presidency or an 8-year presidency, things are not just going to become normal again straight away. Things are not going to become just like they were before, I think. We'll have to wait and see. Social media is incredibly strong. Presidents will be tweeting from now on until eternity, until we find something else to use on social media. President Obama used social media quite a lot, but didn't make it personal. He didn't, he wouldn't sit at home and tweet something late at night or early in the morning instinctually. So, now, I would like to think that the attacks on the press will stop because there are no reasons for us to have those. I'd like to think that presidents will, in the future, not call the press the enemy of the people because it's false, it's unnecessary, it's dangerous, and we need to get away from that. So that's certainly a hope that no journalist is hoping for a change of presidency, but we do have a hope for a change of tone. If it comes from this president, great. If it comes from another one, then great too. But you can't have a president attacking articles that he doesn't like as fake news when they're not, as the Mueller report has shown. And you can't use a term like enemy of the people toward a very important part of U.S. society, in other words, the press. So there will never, I don't think there'll be another president like President Trump. So things will change, but I also don't think there's a way back from this kind of discourse. He's opened the doors to presidential candidates being able and allowed to use that kind of a tone. If you look at the field of 2020 contenders on the left of the Democratic Party, no one really is using that kind of a tactic. There aren't large-scale Twitter attacks. There aren't many insults on the campaign trail at this point. But who knows whether after the Trump presidency comes to an end, again, be it after 1 term or 2 terms, who knows whether there won't be some harking back to another presidential candidate who would be like Donald Trump. So I think now that we've seen the very first edition, so to say, the very first version of such a president, that doesn't mean that there won't be another one.
I have about 2 minutes left. What's the biggest news story you've covered? What was the most impactful news story for you personally?
Well, just before moving to Washington, I covered the revolution in Libya. So it was a war, the only war zone I've ever covered. It's different. There's this strange moment. It sounds awfully pretentious, but where your life is in danger, but you do kind of think somehow it's a little bit worth it because you're telling us a story that otherwise would not be getting out. I think that's why people do this. That's why war correspondents keep on going back. My assignment ended up being a different one, so I only had that one experience. But being in the midst of an actual revolution is something very exciting, first of all, because when a revolution looks like it's working out, people are happy. Turns out the Libyan revolution didn't turn into what it was supposed to be. So I think that's the most impactful thing I've ever reported on. It was exciting, dangerous, very important. It was a big world news story, but I wouldn't leave out the Trump presidency as something that won't be a highlight of any journalist's career.
Right.
I think most of us who are covering the Trump presidency, who are on the White House beat right now, we can't leave. We can't go do something else. You have to stay on because it might be the story of our lifetimes, and it feels like it many times over. Being at the White House anyway is special. Seeing a president like Donald Trump doing his thing is extraordinary. And I think the impact of the Trump presidency will continue for years to come. So that's what we'll be covering. And for many of us, it might be the biggest story of our careers.
Wonderful conversation with you. Thank you so very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Wish you all the best. Philip Crowther. And by the way, you can follow him on Instagram as well as Twitter at PhilipNDC. By the way, you can see more of our conversations online at WSRE.org/conversations, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take wonderful care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.